In the lecture on democratic consolidation, we talked about the factors that make democracy stable and resilient. What brings about the crossing of a political threshold where democracy is very unlikely to break down. If democracies are not consolidated, if they don't develop these deep roots of institutional strength and legitimacy, then democracy is much more vulnerable to breakdown or failure by one means or another. And in this lecture, I want to look at how democracy is lost and how the failure of democracy can be prevented, what's necessary to avert the breakdown of democracy. Let's begin by looking at two different ways of thinking about this problem. One is the structural approach, and the other is the actor-centered, or what's sometimes called the voluntaristic approach. One is deterministic. It considers that breakdown is shaped by deep structural factors, and perhaps elites don't have much choice within that. And the other emphasizes that whatever the initial starting conditions for democracy, whether they're highly favorable or very challenging, within those constraints, actors have tremendous scope either to move democracy towards stability and legitimacy and deep consolidation, or to sustain democracy in difficult circumstances, or on the other hand, to undermine democracy and bring about its downfall. In the structural approach, what's sometimes called the deterministic approach, we look at the deep sociological and economic and to some extent political conditions for democracy and ask whether these are favorable conditions. So if a country's very poor, if it has low economic growth, it's not meeting people's expectations in terms of economic performance. It's deeply divided along ethnic lines. It has very inappropriate institutional designs. It has very inappropriate institutional designs for managing ethnic conflict. Perhaps it has a very majoritarian political system when in fact we know that if you have deep ethnic divisions, we need to structure in incentives for people to play by the democratic rules, and that means some devolution of power or sharing of power or some mechanisms to break ethnic solidarities. So the perspective here would be, well, look, if democracy breaks down when none of the facilitating conditions were there to sustain it, you can't blame it on elites who were acting rationally, so to speak, within the incentive structure of the day. It was almost destined to fail, is the argument. And the other approach is if you look at democratic transitions and then breakdowns, you see a very prominent role, really a decisive role for actors, for individuals and groups, and the choices they make. And we can look at mass actors and the pressures they put on the political system, the demands they make, the way that mass level groups, political parties, interest groups, social movements, trade unions, may stress a political system and put unreasonable demands and pressures on their leaders, on the elites. A second perspective within the actor-centered approach is, and you will find this in the work of both Juan Linz and Nancy Bermeo, is you really can't excuse elites from responsibility for the breakdown of democracy. Even if conditions are challenging or unfavorable, we find that elites have choices they can make, and that when they betray democracy through their greed, both economically and politically, through their strategic calculations that may be driven by the overwhelming desire to get and retain power at all costs, through their apathy, through corruption and misgovernments, whatever it might be. These play enormous and ultimately decisive roles in bringing down democracy. And then, of course, we can't fail to pay attention to the military as an actor. One of the most common means by which democracy fails is a military coup. Well, when the military acts to overthrow democracy, maybe there's been a systemic failure of democracy in some way, or maybe the structural conditions were very unfavorable, but we have to look at the motives of the military. What might have driven them because of personal motives for power and wealth, because of the organizational interests of the military that they think can only be protected by taking power or displacing the current elected incumbents in power, by different military factions that may be battling for supremacy, and of course these can even be on ethnic lines. So we've got a wide range of perspectives here, kind of a theoretical framework for interpreting democratic breakdown. And of course, there is a synthetic approach that structural conditions matter a great deal. And if you have favorable structural conditions, in particular, if a democracy emerges in a country with very substantial wealth in per capita income, then we know from the work of Adam Przeworski and his colleagues that it's extremely unlikely that democracy will fail. In fact, using their threshold of about $6,000 per capita in 1985 purchasing power parity dollars, we can say with some confidence that if a democracy emerges in a country at kind of an upper middle income level, so translating their level literally now, it would be about $10,000 in purchasing power parity dollars, gross net per capita gross national income. But take that up by 50%, and then it's even more difficult to imagine democracy breaking down for internal reasons. In other words, even if elites are not terribly responsible, may be equivocating in their deep internal value system about the importance of democracy, democracy nevertheless, because of the changes societies go through at higher levels of economic development, is quite likely to survive. And in such countries, maybe if you have inappropriate institutional designs, democracy won't work very well. It would work better with different institutional designs, but it won't fail as a result of them. And in this synthetic approach, if you have favorable conditions, then democracy can survive bad leadership. If you have unfavorable conditions, then the quality of political leadership and of the choices in behavior that different types of important political organizations make matter much more decisively to the future of democracy. So with that framework in mind, we can summarize the debate, and it often is done in the literature as a theoretical argument between structure and agency. Is it social and political structure that determines what the fate of democracy is? Is a democracy condemned by having a low level of economic development, low levels of education, a highly fractured society along ethnic lines, weak and poorly designed political institutions, or is it political leaders that make the choices and must therefore assume the lion's share of the responsibility for the failure of democracy? Of course, if we look again at this slide, we can see the structural approach depicted here. And in this structural approach, we see the very important role of such factors as level of economic or human development, the country's place in the global economy, and whether that is favorable to its economic growth and political democratization. Is it embedded in a structure like the OECD or the European Union, where the cost of defecting from democracy would be high? What is its class structure? Is it extremely unequal in a way that would polarize the party system? And has it got a very polarized ethnic structure that might affect the intensity of politics? But I would like to note as well that we see here also the important role of performance, both economic performance and political performance, in shaping this crucial factor, the legitimacy of democracy. So when democracy is legitimate for whatever reasons, it could be as a result of cultural values that have existed in the country for a very long time, and norms of tolerance and cooperation and valuing of public input, public participation, popular sovereignty, that may even be very consistent with or in some ways grow out of long-standing traditional culture and religious norms. If there's legitimacy, then there's likely to be political stability for democracy. But we see that economic performance, again, has a very big impact on legitimacy. Now, on the other hand, we can also see that political leadership is a very important factor affecting the stability of democracy. First of all, political leadership affects economic performance and political performance of democracy. Do political leaders govern in a way that is skillful, smart, judicious in terms of macroeconomic management? We have increasingly lessons about what works and doesn't work in terms of fostering economic growth, attracting international investment, inducing domestic capital to invest, securing property rights, and so on. Are political leaders learning those lessons in a way that fosters steady economic growth? Are they making choices that reduces inequality and so ensures that politics will not be so polarized along class or ethnic or other lines of cleavage? And then the political questions are the leaders of a country respecting the Constitution, respecting the rule of law, affirming and defending the rights of minorities, including the rights of opposition in the parliament and in society? And are they governing with transparency and restraint, or are they drenching their own behavior and the politics of the country in patron-client relations and the relentless pursuit of rents to be collected in order to enrich themselves, their cronies, their families, and so on? When you have good leadership, you have all of these things working in a way that will promote the legitimacy of democracy. But we also want to note here that political leadership can have a very direct effect on the stability of democracy, separate and apart through the way its impact is mediated by beliefs on the part of the public about the legitimacy of the political system that's in place. And the reason for this more direct impact is that some instances of democratic breakdown have been engineered by the elected leaders themselves, who overturn democracy in order to aggrandize their power and entrench themselves in power. And we have in the Spanish language a term for this. It's called autogolpe, or self-coup. When a leader like Alberto Fujimori in Peru in the early 1990s suspends Congress and declares himself a power above the law or above any form of accountability, you can say, well, there was a political crisis in the country, and there was, that has many of the kinds of features that Lintz is talking about. You can say there were problems of governability or security or economic performance or whatever, but nevertheless, an elected leader made a choice to overturn democratic institutions, and that is not something that can simply be attributed to structural conditions in the country.